Warm welcome from my side. My name is Ralf Isenmann, and I'm really happy, also losing the football match yesterday, that we today will focus on foresight, and especially we will focus on technology road mapping. First of all, let me please share the screen. Can you see the slides, please?
Yes.
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 Great.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Yes.
So in the first day, we have had a nice kickoff here with a very powerful overview about foresight management and the different tools and methods to be used. In the second day, Adriana raised the bar and he focused on the Delphi technique as an effective tool. And today we like to focus on technology road mapping. So before starting, please let me just spend a very few words to my person and to the institutional background. I'm from the Wilhelm Büchner University. This is a University of Applied Sciences located in Darmstadt. It's very close to Frankfurt. And the Wilhelm Büchner Hochschule is specialized in distance and online learning. Currently with about 6,000 students. And we are, in a sense, very proud to start a master course of study, especially on foresight management late this year. Prior to Wilhelm Büchner University, I joined the Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovation Research in Karlsruhe. So in a sense, I'm a colleague, a prior colleague of Katrin. And Martin and me, we share the same academic home base. This is the Technical University of Kaiserslautern. So Martin and me, we are in a sense like an old-fashioned couple, more or less. Yeah. That's we are sharing the same interests in research. So today we like to share our expertise, our experience in technology roadmap, and probably the most important thing is that we meet your expectations from these sessions. So I would like to ask, what are your expectations? What are your preferences? What are your wishes we shall address in this session? Probably you have participated in some technology road mapping projects, or you have been participants, or you have lead it, for example. So what are your expectations? So please make your comments in the chat function, or the first question, yeah, how to integrate technology road mapping with other tools of foresight and forecast. Okay, so this is actually a really interesting issue, because one of the key characteristics of technology road mapping, or broader speeding of road mapping, is to link road mapping with other instruments, for example, with scenario technique or the Delphi method. Especially, there is a very close linkage between scenario technique and road mapping. More or less, scenario technique and road mapping are like sisters and brothers. And probably we have some slides in the presentation to figure out and to make clear this linkage. Next question from Jacqueline. To learn about technology road mapping. Okay, this is how it may work, or how it may work. That means to have a certain focus on the do's and don'ts, on how technology is being implemented and is working in practice, or for example, how to introduce in an organization. We will address this question as well. Thank you for that. Another comment from Margarita: how to structure better a technology roadmap with the different features. Okay, so that's a real core issue in technology road mapping. The architecture, the overall structure, how to design a roadmap. That actually means which planning perspectives we will finally include, and at what aggregation level we will design these planning perspectives. This is, in a sense, this is partly an artwork. That means it is a matter of experience of you as a road mapper. And probably you may take the opportunity to do the road mapping again and again, and out of that you will get a feeling which is the proper level of aggregation and which is the proper level of designing roadmap architecture. We will also have an example in the breakout sessions later on. Next question from Fidel. This method's new to me. I'd like to understand the basis. Okay, the basis. We will address this issue rather early in the presentation, the basic underlying idea. Learning. Tadeu, learn about the methods and the best practice. Okay. Probably we have a presentation of a so-called good practice example in a selected industry, and probably you'll get an insight how to do it rather properly. Another question from Thomas: the theory and the link between theory and case studies. Okay, we'll, as we have a practice-oriented first online training, we will address the theory behind. There is a theory, but we'll more focus on the practice. So probably if you are interested in, please do not hesitate to contact me. I can provide you with some academic papers building the emerging body of theory behind technology road mapping. Oh, I see a lot of other questions. Technology road mapping, yeah, in technical change, the methodology. I see you are fully involved. Yeah, and probably some of you may have been involved in technology road mapping projects as well. So I will pick up probably the most part of the questions, and please interrupt me to get further information on what you are actually interested in. The program we have provided so far is organized in 3 building blocks. In the first building block, you see in the first 90 minutes, I like to provide some basic ideas of technology road mapping, and especially focusing on the roadmaps architecture. That's really one of the core issues providing a fine and efficient road mapping project. Then I will also present a process model or 2 process models of technology road mapping. And finally, we'll have an insight to a case study where technology road mapping is applied in a selected industry. That's the first building block. Then, of course, we feel rather exhausted, I guess. And then we'll have a break. And based on this basic understanding, then we'll have breakout sessions with methods and practices and short presentations. You'll have 3 options to dive into the world of technology road mapping. And finally, in the third building block, we'll have a short concluding discussion. And of course, Katrin has the opportunity to provide some closing remarks. Hopefully, you will find this program as interesting and as acceptable. And so now I would like to start and dive into the first building block, the basic understanding. And therefore, I think it makes use to address 3 leading questions to get a solid understanding of technology road mapping and technology roadmaps. First, what are roadmaps? Second, what is the basic underlying idea of technology road mapping? And third, what is the difference between technology road mapping or road mapping, broadly speaking, and roadmaps? So these are the 3 leading questions we may address and probably try to answer in the next few minutes. Well, literally, a roadmap, as you probably know, is a visualization from one place to another. It's a chart of the road or a development path from one place to another. That's a quite simple idea, and probably as you have a driving license for a long time, you probably know what a geographical roadmap actually is. And this is also a good starting point to get an idea of the basic underlying idea of the world of road mapping or technology road mapping. There's a strong analogy. And let's approach this underlying idea by asking, which information do you get from a geographical roadmap? That's the first part of the question. And second, I would like to know which information you may feel is documented in the technological counterparts. What do you think? So please use the chat function to share your ideas. Yeah, Derval, Garcia, the destination and the certain directions. Great, yeah. The distance, probably from one time to another. And of course, the estimated time to get from one place to another. Great, yes. The options of connections that could be taken from one place to another. Yeah, great. The certain stops that could be made. Yeah, great. The point where we are, yes, the starting point and the place we want to go to arrive. Yes, the goal, the objectives, and the paths that could be taken. Great. The planning. Yeah, the idea is to get from one point to another, selecting probably the best path. Yeah, probably the critical path you know from other planning technologies. Great, yeah. The different options of ways. Yeah, great. So you feel so involved. It's great. Locations and alternatives to get any there. Yeah. Probably the barriers. Yeah, you think of rivers or oceans or other mountains, for example. Flavia, great potential resources available along the road. Exactly, great, yeah. The road chef, for example, to have a break. Jacqueline, the planning to accelerate the path towards the future, incorporating the technology innovation in the way. Great, yeah, probably there is a short track towns in the way, yeah, for example, to have some sightseeings. Great. Streets versus highways, yeah, the different levels. And could you please try to transfer these information into the technological counterpart? What do you think might be included, or which information is actually documented in technology roadmaps or other forms of roadmap? Great. So Roxana adds the different technical solutions available. Yeah, great. Probably there are different opportunities to realize certain product features. For example, in the automobile industry, we have a great discussion between fuel engines and other forms of engines. Which technologies, Derval, Garcia, yeah, which technologies need to be developed to get the final product, services, and processes? Great, exactly. So how different technologies can be combined? Exactly, probably there are converging technologies, yeah. We've heard a lot from Martin and Adriana in the last few days that probably some technologies might converge and might be combined. For example, the diffusion of IT technology in bioscience, in material science, in fashion designs, and all these technologies. Great. Derval, yeah, which competencies are available? Yeah, exactly. If you are thinking in terms of the stuff, of the experts that are needed to develop these technologies, great, yeah. It's also a matter of the universities to And to the students, Santiago adds the stakeholders, for example, the companies or ID centers leading a technology, promoting, for example, like development programs or spending other resources. Great. So I feel you have fully understood the idea of technology road mapping. And in fact, there are a number of strong analogies between the roadmap, the geographical roadmap as an origin on the left-hand side, and their technological counterpart on the right-hand side. And this strong analogy makes it rather easy to get an understanding and to get a feeling what a technology roadmap actually is and how it can be used. Let's please take this analogy in mind when going further to any details. So let's start with a number of examples I have provided. This is the first example. Is it an example from a very simple example from Hitachi in the early 2000s? This is an example of a roadmap for computers. Yeah? And please keep in mind that roadmaps are represented in various forms and formats. And the idea behind is that any format, any specific format or form usually covers a certain message. That's one part of the story of a roadmap. A roadmap carries a certain communication message, a clear strategy. In this example, it's a rather easy form. You see the horizontal X usually is describing the time horizon. And the vertical X, you see here the performance indicator. And such a form might be particularly suitable for a technology development that is characterized by a single key performance indicator. Here in this example, it's the capacity of the hard disk. And you see more or less the development path. This is just one example. A second example, this is a very common, very popular example of a product roadmap. It's an example that was made public in the late 1990s. It's a roadmap, it's a product roadmap from Motorola describing the next generations of car radio receivers. And here you see the typical feature of a roadmap, the horizontal axis on top, and the vertical axis, the different planning perspectives. And the planning perspectives, like the opportunities, the alternatives of tuning, of selectivity, the underlying IC technology, the different features, realizing the display, etc. And finally, on the bottom, you see the different product generations so far from the early 1980s to the early 1990s. So this is more or less a very engineering Latin form of a technology roadmap. The next example is a roadmap for display technology, its size and its distribution, spreading and distributing to various devices. And as the two former ones, the horizontal X is describing the time horizon, and the vertical X, you see the technology and its size, describing the distribution of display technology to various devices over time. And you see which display technology is being available in certain devices. To sum up, I would like to depict the certain characteristics of a roadmap in this final example. So we can summarize that a roadmap typically provides a structured visualization representing a certain architecture of future developments of technologies or products or other issues over time, usually in a short, medium, and long-term perspective. And now I would like to go a bit into detail, making clear the certain distinct features describing a roadmap, what makes a roadmap to a roadmap. The first, you see on top, the horizontal axis is typically describing the time scale. And you could structure the time scale into midterm, short-term, midterm, long-term. It depends on the time horizon. That's the first characteristic. The second, usually depicted on the vertical axis, there are certain planning perspectives. These planning perspectives are more or less representing the routes and the roads from now to the future. This is the second characteristic. The third, you see different activities, single developments, structured in certain planning perspectives. And these single developments are usually combined. If they are combined in the same planning perspective, then we'll call it a development path. And if they are combinations between different planning perspectives, then we are talking about relations. In this example, one certain activity induces another activity in another planning perspective. So this is usually the case in certain roadmaps. So finally, we'll have these 5 characteristics that usually make a roadmap to a roadmap. This example is a roadmap from the Aluminium Association. And the story behind is that the companies involved in the aluminium industry try to share their efforts in R&D. And so they get a common understanding in which directions the aluminium industry should develop. So they can share their efforts in research and development. So we may keep in mind these 5 more or less characteristics of a roadmap. What are no roadmaps? Probably you may be familiar with a network plan that is usually being applied in business administration and all these neighboring disciplines. But the network plan is in a sense different to the world of road mapping, because in the network plan we have activities and developments that are strongly coupled, very strongly. And the second distinction is that we have usually single planning issues in terms of processes and arrangements. So network plan is quite different to road mapping. Further, an environmental radar is quite different to technology road mapping, because typically in an environmental radar, as Martin and Adriana told us, Monday and Tuesday, usually we have various layers, but the developments in these certain layers are not evidently coupled. So these are more or less quite distinct developments. In road mapping, usually we have relations. We have a development path, and we have the relations between the different developments or activities. And a further difference is an environmental radar usually carries no clear communication or no clear strategic message. That's typical for road maps. To give you an idea, that road maps are often labeled as road maps, but this is an example that road maps could be easily oversimplified, like here. Yeah, we have a time scale describing the horizontal axis, but we have no relation, no linkage, no link between these different things, and so it's not really depicting a good roadmap. An indicator that roadmaps have become widespread and popular and common is, that's a good part of the story, they are used by governments for communications and a number of announcements, but probably the content more or less is quite poor. So this is the bad thing of the story. Widespread at one hand, but serious and efficient use on the other hand. So please keep in mind the different characteristics that make a roadmap to a roadmap. Time scale, planning perspective, developments, relations, development paths. These are more or less the core ingredients, you may call it, that make roadmaps to roadmaps. Well, while road mapping and roadmaps are viewed rather sexy, we could find more or less three basic characteristics. One of the characteristics is that road mapping facilitates out-of-the-box thinking. It makes the implicit now explicit. And this is especially the case while for road mapping you usually need the expertise of experts. So road mapping is usually a planning tool involving experts. That's the first characteristic. Second, on the right side, technology road mapping or road mapping uses solid instruments of futurology, like Delphi, scenario technique, and other methods and other building blocks we have heard about in the overview Martin talked to us Monday. So road mapping could be an anchoring instrument or a flagship instrument linking other instruments. That's the second characteristic. And thirdly, road mapping is an instrument that it's rather flexible. So there are various options to use road mapping at different level. For example, at the level of certain departments, or at the level of certain organizations, or at the corporate level, or at the industry level, or at the national level, or at the science level, or at the international level, etc., etc. So you can customize road mapping to your very specific needs. And these three characteristics in some make it as a very flexible, very hands-on, and very more or less sexy instrument. The basic underlying terminology, I think, is quite simple. On the left-hand side, you see the definition of road mapping. And talking about road mapping represents the so-called process-oriented perspective. What does it mean, the process-oriented perspective? Process-oriented perspective means that all activities for providing and updating and using roadmaps we call road mapping. That's the process perspective. From provision to update, to generate, to keep it alive. All these processes, these tasks, we call it road mapping. Corresponding on the right-hand side, the output-oriented perspective, the result or the temporary result, we call it a roadmap. The structured visualization of developments along the time. I think it's quite easy. So if the target issue is technology, we are talking about technology road mapping or technology roadmap. Or if we are talking about products or services, we are talking about product road mapping, or broadly speaking, road mapping at all. So this is the basic underlying terminology. I think it's quite simple. You are familiar probably with that. In a nutshell, we may think of a roadmap as a representation being used as an essential planning tool for development paths. That's exactly what you have, what you actually and already know from the geographical roadmap. A roadmap finally facilitates the navigation. It facilitates orientation. So, and it is providing navigation by a properly structure. We usually call it an architecture, and the smartly visualization, usually carrying a message. Think of the man on the left corner above trying to go from the left side to the right side. You see the landscape, and he tries to find out the proper way, overcoming the barriers, the hurdles from his starting point to the goal, to the end point. So roadmaps help to anticipate the obstacles and select probably the most efficient route or some alternatives through a complex and different landscape with some hurdles, with some barriers, etc. So this is quite, I think, obvious and very hands-on and very practical to use. Well, trying to figure out the instrument of road mapping in the overall toolbox of foresight management, as Martin has figured out, option to structure the application of trying to figure out the different tools according to the X of quantitative tools, on the different tools. And this is the roadmap typically may cover a broad range in between a quantitative nature and a qualitative nature. Typically, it depends on the tools and the instruments and the building blocks that are applied to make the roadmaps actually to a solid planning tool. And usually in practice, these tools are combined and interlinked, and that's the real power to make the instruments actually work and to derive the insights from these tools. To sum up, roadmaps we call essential planning tools for foresight management that could be used at different levels. And 7 key features may characterize the very nature of these roadmaps. The first characteristic or the feature is that roadmaps address the development of a certain key issue, usually technology or an underlying product, an application or field of application, usually linked with other domains or a combination. Second, roadmaps include technological parameters as well as other ones. For example, performance indicators like the size or velocity or the capacity of the hard disk, etc. Usually the roadmaps are built on a system that is usually loosely coupled compared to network planning on the one hand and environmental radar on the other. The fourth characteristic, they have a certain architecture, they have a certain logic behind which planning perspective actually are involved and which not. And this architecture need to be customized according to key issue and purpose. Fifth, roadmaps typically integrate information from various foresight tools, for example, Delphi, Scenario, etc. They carry a certain message and have visual power, and that's the reason why why firms and ministries typically like to visualize their message in roadmaps. For example, the European Commission typically requires that any research project may provide at least a roadmap, for example, for applications and further use. And seventh, roadmaps could be used as single road mapping instruments and as well as fully institutionalized planning tools, for example, in combination with the world of products, requirements, applications, resources we have seen. So more or less, it depends on the scope. And the scope finally makes if a roadmap is solely labeled as roadmap or another combination. So these few slides may provide a common basic understanding what actually is meant by road mapping or roadmap and the certain characteristics of a roadmap. So probably we get a common basic understanding what we are talking about in the next hours. So probably some questions may occur, so please feel free to use the chat function to address your questions, please. From Nicole, I got a comment that the difference between a Gantt diagram versus road mapping. Yeah, good question. A Gantt diagram more or less is an instrument from the project management, and of course, yes, there are different perspectives, like for example, the working packages. Exactly. And also the working packages are systematically linked over a period of time. So more or less, we can see a Gantt diagram more or less as a certain simple form of roadmap. Yes, we can see it. Yes, it's not the same, but it's a very easy and very simple form of roadmap in a sense. From Diego, we got a question: evaluation indicators along the road. I am not quite sure how to answer this question. Diego, could you please try to specify and to rephrase the question behind?
I will talk. So maybe it's easier. Now, how to monitor the progress of the map after the design. So you have some performance indicator evaluations to say, okay, we are doing good. This is the right road. What we're going, something like that.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Diego. Very important question. And the clear message is to keep road mapping alive. To keep road mapping alive. That means we have to update the roadmap actually again and again for a certain period of time. And it depends on the purpose. If we are using roadmaps for a strategic plan, probably we may update the roadmap on an annual basis. But if we are going to use the roadmap for operational management, then it is part of the daily routine. For example, in innovation management, technology management, product management. Please keep in mind the example of the Motorola product roadmap. Yeah? So companies are using roadmaps, for example, VW at their operational management, and so they need to update it very, very often. Yeah? Typically, they may use of software tools, specialized software tools, and of course, yes, as you see, then you need to check whether the assumptions you have made are actually happening or not. Then you have to adapt. So the clear message is, depending on the purpose, to keep the road mapping alive. And that's in practice one of the great challenges, yeah, because usually we like to provide a roadmap, a nice picture, a nice brochure, and then to keep it in our table, yeah, closed, yeah. That makes limited sense. Okay? Thank you. Other questions? I try to answer other questions. Okay. About who is allowed to make the roadmap. We choose an expert group like Delphi method. Yes, from Mirel. Hopefully I pronounced it right. Sorry when I'm wrong. Yes, road mapping typically is a flagship instrument of Foresight, usually involving experts. Because you need the expertise to foresee the development in the certain planning perspective. For example, if you are trying to figure out a roadmap depicting the technology development, you need an expert to have a solid understanding how the technology actually may develop, and usually then you need to involve experts. Yeah? You can do it, for example, by a Delphi method. Then you could, for example, design a certain amount of scenarios to get an understanding of the possible futures. And the next step then is to design a roadmap as a navigation to develop from the starting point to the certain point depicted in a scenario. For example, if you are develop two scenarios, then afterwards you may need to develop two roadmaps. One roadmap depicting the way, the development part, starting from now to scenario 1. And the second roadmap depicting the navigation, the development path from the starting point to the scenario B. And the great advantage is then to couple these different development paths like a folie, like a slide. And you can see when comparing where is the common and where are the different issues. Probably you can get a feeling where the ways may be bifurcate. No, but yes, you're right. You may need experts to get a solid and robust understanding of the developments. Yes. The next question from Claudia: is there any difference between technology road mapping versus product road mapping? Okay. Yes and no. Yeah. Yes and no. If you are just focusing on the technological development, then we may call it a technology roadmap, solely focusing on the technological development. But usually this is often combined and systematically linked with the product generations, as we usually develop technologies not for itself, but usually to get the technology available to realize certain product features. And so it makes sense to combine roadmaps and to include the planning perspective, for example, product requirements and underlying technologies that make the product features actually working or available. Okay, so finally, it depends on the scope, what you are actually focusing on. It is just technology? Is it just product requirements, or do you want to combine these as a broad spectrum? Huh? Hopefully this may answer your question. We will see an example in the case study, in the selected industry. Often it makes sense to separate the product requirements and the technology development. It makes sense to first develop these roadmaps separately and then trying to combine, to marriage more or less, yeah. Because it's like in our life, yeah. Marriage is a very important issue, and you can it has an impact in its real sense. We will see exactly this marriage, this linkage later on in the case study. A remark from Joanna. Can you highlight the last point again about single roadmap and roadmap paired with a product? I will focus, or we will have emphasize this in the case study. Probably, I'm sure this will be very clear. Finally, it's a matter of the scope if you are talking about the roadmap. But don't care about labeling. Yeah, the artwork is to find the right scope of the road mapping project. Diego? Oh, fine question. Is there any disadvantage of using technology road mapping? Of course, yeah. Any instrument has certain advantages and also certain disadvantages. Honestly speaking, leading more than 20 or 30 road mapping projects, road mapping projects could be very laborious, very time consuming, very expensive in a sense. If you think of large scale road mapping projects, for example, trying to describe the development of whole industries or whole technologies at national or international level. And probably this might be seen as a disadvantage. And usually a roadmap provides no clear answer at first, but raises a number of other questions. And probably if you may expect easy answers quickly, then the road mapping could be misleading. It depends on the solid instruments you are actually fueling the road mapping procedure. Hopefully addressing your question. Diego, thank you for that. Carlos, next question. Who should participate in a technology road mapping exercise? Is it a bottom-up or a top-down process? Good question. I would like to answer it in the following way. It depends on the scope and the budget. Who to involve, who to integrate in the road mapping exercise. Honestly speaking, at least you may need an expert for describing the development path of any planning perspective. That's more or less the minimum. And you can use road mapping as well as a bottom-up or and a top-down process as well. Probably we'll get some insights also in the case study later on. Adriana adds, I think Delphi is consult experts' opinion tools and roadmap is one planning tool. Yes and no, we can couple. I've been involved in in a complex research project commissioned by the German Environmental Agency on the non-ferrous metals industry by a Delphi method in 2 rounds. And based on that, later on, then we designed and developed 2 scenarios. And based on these 2 scenarios, one tailwind, one headwind, we later on tried to design 2 roadmaps. And so it could be realized as a planning tool, and it could be also designed with another underlying purpose. So yes and no, it depends. It's a rather academic, this answer, sorry for that. So probably we have answered the question raised. Thank you for these clever and obvious questions. Thank you for that. So let's proceed to the next aspect, the importance of a roadmap's architecture. Here we see something as the theory of road mapping. On the left-hand side, you see the typical functional perspectives that are being used in road mapping projects. For example, the market perspective, the business perspective, the product perspective, service, system, technology, research resources. Yeah. In the middle, you see the typical ingredients that make a roadmap to a roadmap, the time axis as the horizontal axis, and the certain developments and activities and their linkages over time. On the right-hand side, you see the value you could gain from roadmaps. That is the why, the what, and the how, usually combining the world of pull and push. That means we can derive information, what drives a certain market, what are the underlying strategies of firms or the actors, what are the needs that drive a certain demand. Further, we can get information about the design and the performance indicator. And further on, we have an idea of the solutions and the capabilities and the resources needed to actually make technologies and products make available at certain markets. So this is the overarching framework underlying the world of road mapping and roadmaps. So the key questions may sound rather simple. On the left-hand side, from the past, where are we now? What is the status quo? On the right-hand side, where do we want to go? Or where could we go? It's the term, or it's a matter of explanatory or normative. And in between, how can we get from the left-hand side to the right-hand side? And that's typically the question which are asked to the experts. And this is more or less describing the overall underlying framework of roadmaps. This might be very condensed, but I think it's quite easy to understand. So next to the theory, the underlying conceptual framework is that there are interrelations, a number of interrelations between what is happening on the market or certain market segments, and on the very bottom, what is researched in scientific disciplines. We see a number of interrelations, and we see an interwoven network of interrelations, links, and relations. And so a roadmap architecture is more or less a lens, a strategic lens of a certain part of this overall framework. It's a strategic lens to highlight certain things or to lay shadow about. So this is the conceptual background. I will not go into deepen this academic field. If you are interested, please feel free to contact me. But the more important aspect is, why is a roadmap's architecture of particular importance, and how can we start to develop a roadmap's architecture? I think that's the crucial questions we are confronted and we are faced when being a roadmapper. Well, a roadmap's architecture needs to be designed according to the certain underlying purpose. That's the very basic. But then we have to design which planning perspectives we will pick and design, which number, which structure, which level of detail. For example, some perspectives we may divide into certain sub-perspectives. This is the matter of the architecture. And the second is, which message do we want to carry? That's the matter of visualization. Well, as a general recommendation, we may customize the road mapping according to the purpose, to the underlying purpose, to the underlying process model we may apply, of course, to the resources available. Do we have millions of euros or other currencies? Or is there any time restriction? Do we need to provide the roadmap at once? Or do we have time, for example, 3 months, half a year, 2 years? Then the roadmap architecture will be completely different. To give you an idea, let's have a look to the example autonomous driving. And the starting point is that the management or any other institution may investigate the domain of autonomous driving. And the question now is, which planning perspectives might be a proper starting point for a roadmap. And we can use a number of starting points to design a proposal. For example, a technology-focused morphology, for example, split it in IT technologies, in mechatronic technologies, or mechanical technologies. So it makes sense to be more detailed in this respect. Or do we actually focus on the products, for example, fully autonomous driving or partly autonomous driving? That makes a difference. Or shall we be more concrete in the application fields? For example, autonomous driving for the countryside, or for certain climate zones, or for cities, for highways. It's completely different. Or may we provide more details in terms of the customer segments? For example, male and female, please don't hit me. Or young people, older people, beginners, experts. These are all different opportunities to find the right aggregation level to finally design our roadmap. And it's completely different. And we can combine these different principles. For example, one planning perspective, we would be very broad. And in the core, addressing the focus, we would then split into certain sub-perspective. And this is exactly what makes road mapping partly an artwork. Yeah, you may get the right feeling, and you need to correspond. You may talk to your agency or to the client, listening very carefully what you are actually expecting. And then you need to customize the architecture, finally find out the right number of perspectives and sub-perspectives, etc., etc. This is partly an artwork. An example here from the DLR, that also the roadmap perspectives, the planning perspectives on the vertical axis need to be labeled smartly. For example, at the top, the external drivers could be split into general drivers addressing the politics, and also designing a sub-perspective research-specific drivers. That could be an idea. Or in terms of the resources that would be needed to run the development at the ground, you see the difference between players or actors and other resources that are needed, like finance, infrastructure, and other things like staff, experts, or patents. So you may get a feeling how it is actually an artwork and a matter of exercising which is the right level of aggregation, finally generating an architecture of a roadmap that is felt to be proper. That's a very brief idea of the importance of the roadmap's architecture. We'll have later on in the breakout sessions the opportunity that you can practice and exercise that. But the opportunity here, any questions, please raise and use the chat function. No questions, so I feel we can proceed. Yeah, have a look at the time. Let's have a look to the different process models that could be used to technology road mapping. What are process models? That's one question, and I would very briefly introduce or give you an idea of two very common or very basic characteristics of two procedure models. The one is the very famous T-plan of the colleagues in Cambridge University, and the other one is the approach of technology road mapping Martin and me often use when doing road mapping projects. Well, first, a process model usually is a scheme. It's a simplification. It's a simplification and a model of how to perform technology road mapping. That means which steps need to be done, or which tasks, which processes need to be conducted along a certain procedure or order or sequence. And here we have provided an overview of 4 different process models. I will just give you a brief idea of the right-hand process models, the so-called T-plan. It's a very popular process model introduced by the colleagues from Cambridge University, and the other one is the fast start approach, quickly starting technology road mapping. Martin and me usually are applying. Well, the first plan I would like to mention is the so-called T-plan, and it's a process model of technology road mapping applied in hundreds of case studies with stable in stable industries usually. And the overall process model looks like a process starting from the divergent process, finally approaching a rather convergent process. Please keep in mind the Motorola product roadmap. So the starting idea was to explore how may the future generations of car receivers may look like. Then experts are asked to shape and then to plan and finally to implement the future generations of the car radio receivers. So this is the usual overall process from divergent to convergent process. And it is actually developed according to a sequence of 4 separate workshops. And these workshops are linked by so-called analysis grids you find in the slides in the left corner at the bottom. The 4 workshops are starting with the issues of strategy and markets, trying to identify the market drivers and business drivers. In the second workshop, you may think about the product requirements and the product features. In the third workshop, you may think about the technologies that are needed to make the product features actually happen. And in the fourth workshop, finally, you may generate the roadmap, trying to use all the information gained from the 3 workshops before. So this T-plan more or less is a workshop-based process model where all the workshops are linked to one another by these so-called analysis grids. It's like a mobile, yeah? And this is, please remember, the linkage, the interrelation between the developments in the certain planning perspectives that are not totally isolated, but they are loosely coupled. That's the idea behind. The second process model I would like to mention is the fast start approach with its 6 elements, starting with a targeting, defining a technological field, then going on to evaluate the certain drivers, to evaluate the different technology paths, and then finally to generate the roadmap, and based on that to derive a sound strategy based on the roadmap generation. I will give you a quick idea of these certain steps, illustrated by a project we carried out. This project was called Threefold, and it's a German-Tunisian project focused on the so-called hydroponics. And the application partners in Tunisia were very innovative Tunisian research centers. And this project in particular includes, you see it on the left-hand side, 3 Tunisian research centers. One is focused on energy technology, the other is focused on water technology, and the other is focused on biotechnology. And this consortium actually developed hydroponics solutions. You can see it on the left-hand side. It's more or less like a container box, trying to speed up the growth of food and other things in countries with very poor water and very poor available soil to grow the food. Usually we use the so-called technology complex, and the technology complex is a scheme that is really helpful to start trying to define what is within the scope and what is the surrounding system. Please remember, as Martin told Monday, no technology exists in itself, but usually any technology is embedded in a broader system, like the system is depending on complementary technologies or competing technologies. Usually the technology depends on preceding technologies that go into certain hydroponic technologies. And also customer demand matters. And you see, this technology complex is a very helpful and very powerful scheme to use and to make clear the different ingredients that are the drivers that may have an influence to the development of a certain technology. And here you see that this technology complex is usually discussed in a workshop format, including the experts and the other participants from the 3 Tunisian research centers. That is, experts from water technology, experts from biotechnology, and experts from energy technology. In a more detailed fashion, we figured out this technology complex in this example, and you see the results that the group has finally worked out. You see the analyzed technology in the very middle, lighting, irrigation, climate control, etc. You see the different preceding technologies that have an influence. You see the completing technologies, the requirements from the customer demand, the competing technologies, as certain aspects of frugal innovations. For example, the overall general requirements of cheap state-of-the-art technology, using state-of-the-art technology, and solid and robust technology. We have also a practice example later on. The next step is the so-called driver evaluation. And here you see what the group has found, the different drivers that drive the development of the hydroponic technology. You see on the left-hand side the different categories: the political system, the environmental system, the market system, and the social system. Yeah, that's the typical pastel analysis you could apply. You see that the external factors have been transformed in so-called internal factors. And these internal factors further on has been transferred and bridged into concrete required features that the hydroponic technology must or need to be fulfill. Well, this is a typical step that needs to be taken when applying this IPMI fast start approach of road mapping. The analyzed technologies that are here have an influence, are typically on the left-hand side, at the top, temperature and heating. On the left-hand side at the bottom, the different shelves. Then in the middle at the bottom, the water supply with the irrigation, the water belt, and the right-hand side. And the right-hand side at the top, the air condition, the radiator. So these are the different technologies that finally make up the hydroponic overall technology. And for all these different certain technologies, the technology path development has to be evaluated for every certain technology. And based on these certain developments, you can pick and mix the different realizations to the one that you actually evaluate as proper, meeting the required features. And of course, you can do that by a so-called meta road mapping. And meta road mapping, it sounds great, but more or less, honestly speaking, it's a document analysis to best prepare the roadmap generation. Therefore, you can use Foresight studies that are available. You can see scientific publications, patents, etc. But then you can also analyze websites, roadmap archives, business newsletters, etc., etc., etc. You can use anything you would like to that is of value to get an idea of a robust roadmap. And finally, based on these prior steps, you may finally chart and draft a suitable roadmap architecture, how it is actually depicted at the bottom of this slide. So probably this was a very quick ride through the process model. Probably you may have some questions at that time, so please use the chat function. I'm sorry, I'm a bit delayed, but we will make it. There's so much to say, and the world of technology road mapping is so rich with a lot of experiences. No question at that time. Okay. So as we are run out of time at the one hand side, and noting that the most important things are happening in breaks, I think we will make a break right now till 11:45, and then we will very brief have an overview of the case studies combined with an introduction of how to do the breakout sessions. And I think it's more important that you actually do some practical work and not just listening what has been documented in projects. I can, of course, provide you with a full project report of the case study that I like to present here, the technology road mapping story. So we can keep it very brief, and I would suggest that we make a break. We will proceed at 11:45. Probably you may agree. If not, please let me know and hit me. You're fine?
Yes, perfect. That's fine.
11:50, yeah, Claudia propose 11:50. Yeah, that sounds reasonable. I'm sorry that I'm being late. Okay, let's proceed 11:50.
Okay.
Great. So please refresh, have a cup of coffee or gin or whiskey or beer or whatever.
Maybe that's it.
Great. 11:50, back again. Thank you.